Greetings and welcome to another Thursday live stream here at TPPF, where we dive deep into the issues of the day to dissect important underlying topics and shine light on emerging policy solutions to improve society for all members. With all the tense discourse and fruitless rhetoric of the past 6 months, no issue has been more fraught than the discussion around police funding. How much to spend and what to spend it on is a discussion we must have, but that is not what we're here addressing today. No, today we'll be discussing our work on a concept called the Contract for Public Safety. And my colleague Currie Myers has just published this paper that we'll be discussing in depth. This policy suite seeks to strike a difficult balance between the needs of police not to have every jot and tittle painstakingly prescribed in state law and thereby hamstringing the ability of these communities to stay safe, and the ability for these communities to demand accountability for these law enforcement officials. So let's jump right in. Today, I'm joined by two friends and colleagues, Currie Myers and Randy Peterson. So Currie is a visiting senior fellow here at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. He has spoken on criminal justice public policy across the country, including U.S. Senate roundtables. He was also a participant in the White House's 2015 Criminal Justice Reform Summit. Sheriff Myers has a combined 30 years of professional experience as a state trooper, special agent, sheriff, criminologist, professor, and university executive. Try saying all that 5 times fast. He is a nationally recognized expert in criminal justice public policy, as well as organizational management and leadership. Sheriff Myers has earned a Ph.D. in criminal justice and MBA from Southwest University and has a BA in criminal justice from Ottawa College. Myers is currently the president of Sheriff Myers and Associates, a consultancy firm that focuses on business, security, and public policy. Randy Peterson is a senior researcher here at TPPF. Peterson spent 21 years in law enforcement in Bloomingdale, Illinois, working on patrol, investigation, administration, and management. After retiring from the Bloomingdale Police Department, Randy moved to Texas, where he was the director of the Tarrant County College District Criminal Justice Training Center, one of the busiest police training academies in the state. The academy was responsible for the basic training of over 40 different police agencies in the DFW Metroplex, as well as in-service training for current law enforcement officers all over the country. Randy has a BS in legal studies and an MS in justice administration, crime and management from Belleville University. So gentlemen, without further ado, let me kick it right over to Currie. Currie, could you explain to us what the Contract for Public Safety is and what the impetus for that was?
Yes, thanks very much, Derek. Thanks for having us, and I appreciate being a part of the Texas Public Policy Foundation as a senior visiting fellow. It's been an awesome experience, so thank you very much. Basically, the contract for policing is focused on what we need to do organizationally and systematically within law enforcement for opportunities for improvement to become better at what we do. The last thing we want to do is defund the police, but that doesn't mean that there's things that we should look at, things that we should get better at. And not only as police officers and police executives, but elected leaders as well as the community. I think everybody working together needs to understand and be on the same page how law enforcement can be a very and should be a very extremely positive part of government services for everybody. Basically, when you look at the police reform, the first thing that I examined in the paper that I wrote was we need to make sure and reaffirm police officers' due rights. And the first thing you're probably going to say is, well, we already have due rights for everybody. Well, technically, yes, but in the past few years, especially with social media, there is a tendency for people to be found guilty in the public square before they've had a fair trial. And we've seen this occur with law enforcement, especially when it comes to use of force issues and complaints against police officers. The first thing that happens is it gets put up on Facebook or some of the different social media outlets. And then all of a sudden there's this, people have no context to what really occurred. They don't see the entire position. And all of a sudden they've been convicted in the court of public opinion. In many cases, we've even seen prosecutors like most recently in Georgia, where they went ahead and filed charges without a full investigation. In this particular case, the charges were filed prior to the Georgia Bureau of Investigation completing their investigation. So this is a cause for concern. And it's not just police officers that are losing some of those Fourth Amendment rights, but the public in general often can get convicted of something ahead of being able to go through the actual criminal justice system. So that's something we need to be concerned with. The second part is really understanding and limiting the scope of collective bargaining agreements with police unions. Far too often, collective bargaining focuses on things that should be done, like pay, benefits, working conditions, and things like that. But far too often, we see collective bargaining creep into officer discipline, use of force issues, and training. And in many cases, because of that, we're seeing discipline not being able to be done fairly for the police officer, fairly for the community, and in many cases, the discipline that's given to the police officer under those conditions are not actually fulfilled. And in many cases, we see a year can go by before the police officer even has those disciplines, and it's usually gone before an arbitrator, and the arbitrator reduces the discipline. So this is something that we have to be, we want to make sure that police unions stay on focus and stay on track with things that they can do to help the members of their organization. But there's also, from the broader concept, needs to be a community relationship and a relationship with the department on expectations, especially with respect to officer safety. Embracing transparency and accountability within the criminal justice system. So I wrote about an ombudsman type system that allows for effective communication between law enforcement and the community in which they serve. I have a companion paper that I am writing right now that hopefully will be released within the next couple of weeks to a month through Texas Public Policy Foundation that focuses primarily on the ombudsman process, where a complaint system can be done through the state attorney general's office. There's an ombudsman that's appointed, and especially for use of force issues and police shootings, the ombudsman process can be used to make sure that we have a fair and impartial investigation. In accompanying that, having a state investigative agency that's under the attorney general's office that works with the ombudsman that actually investigates aggravated batteries and police shootings. So having that state investigative agency that's a part of the ombudsman, that way we don't have internal police departments investigating their own cases, and we don't have police departments that may have relationships with the officers out in the field where they're investigating those. So it makes, again, another avenue for transparency and accountability. The last couple was to focus on leadership. I wrote a paper in early this summer that talked about bottom-up policing and being able to make sure that we at the ground level communicate effectively with our officers, get their value buy-in, understand what things are going on in the field, make them a part of the goal-setting strategy along with the community. And two other things to consider is whether or not Kansas City, Missouri, for instance, has a police commission that's part of the governor's office. That kind of removes a lot of the political infighting that can occur with a police department, and looking at boards and commissions that can help govern police departments. And the last is making sure that we embrace state databases that can be used for tracking officer complaints, and especially multiple use of force issues. And that can be used in the hiring and vetting process for police officers, especially if they go to different organizations. So that's kind of the background of the paper itself.
Excellent, Kurt. Well, thank you so much. That gave us a lot of food for thought, a lot of topics for conversation going forward here. But I want to bring in Randy real quick while we're still setting the table here. Randy, I just want to ask you, you still are in touch with both officer trainees, in-service trainees, with some of the work you're doing in developing a constitutional training curriculum. What's it like out there for these officers today? And where does I would say the pain points exist that kind of necessitate a different approach than what we've been hearing so far by some of the louder voices in the discussion?
So to answer the first part of your question, I mean, the landscape I think we can see in on the news over this last summer was the landscape was on fire, literally, and unfortunately, the tensions between the community and law enforcement have gone through cycles like this, right? This isn't the first time we've seen civil unrest as a result of a police action. I entered law enforcement at almost exactly the same time that the Rodney King incident happened in Los Angeles. So it's not new that there can be some tension. The difference, though, between now and then is that the social media ability to coordinate rioting, to send viral videos that sometimes don't depict the whole thing has happened, the 24/7 news cycle, all of those things really didn't exist in the Rodney King era, and they do now, so that it has gone nationwide. Now, when I say that it's gone nationwide, I don't see that every department is experiencing this rift with their community. I think that in the major urban areas, we've seen the most unrest, and much less of that as you spread out into the suburbs and into the more rural areas. And that can partially be attributed to political philosophies that tend to dominate major cities versus the suburban and rural areas. That's I think a pretty fair observation. But to ask you, as far as what are police officers facing, it's interesting. As you said, part of my research here at the Texas Public Policy Foundation has included developing training curriculum at a local police academy here. And it's a smaller academy, and there's about a dozen recruits in there. And I asked them very candidly one day when we were in one of our training sessions, I asked them, why do you want to be a police officer? Which is a pretty common question that we'll ask during the academy. But I said, it's particularly important in this environment. Why would you want to enter the profession at this stage, right? All of them signed up and started after all of the rioting had occurred. And to a person, man and woman, they all said that they felt that now was the time that our country really needed good police officers, and they wanted to be part of that. That made me pretty proud to hear that from them, because my concern anytime this happens is that the best and brightest among us will avoid the profession, that we will have the profession will either dilute itself, right? That there will be almost no one left, or that those in there will probably not belong there because that's all we could get. The goal has to be to recruit and train the best personnel for this. This is why the idea of, as you said, the loudest voices, well, the screeching wheel during all this was defund the police, a concept that we weren't even considering 6 or 8 months ago. That no one seriously was talking about it, and it remains a seriously wrong-headed concept. But it's the loud voice right now, and some departments are actually doing that, right? They're bowing to the mob, and they're doing the knee-jerk reaction to something that is always wrong. As conservatives, we don't believe in knee-jerk reactions. We believe in incremental improvements, especially to long-standing institutions like law enforcement. And there's always room for improvement in any government function, and law enforcement's no different from that. But to defund the police shows a complete lack of understanding on the left of what it is that they are even looking to accomplish, right? If we're looking for improvements in policing, cutting the funding has to come from training. It's going to come from personnel. It's going to come from training. But we will resort as law enforcement to the basic functions of patrol. And so all of the things that society expects of police officers, which is a lot, might go by the wayside as they resort only to their core function of patrol, literally just responding to calls because of funding cuts. And there will be limited to no training, which makes for a dangerous police officer. One of the things that I have written about and continue to write about is the fact that a competent and confident police officer is a better police officer. They make better use of force decisions. They resort to force later. Having a well-trained police officer raises that minimum bar that the Graham versus Connor standard set, without doing anything else. You don't even have to change your policies or anything in order to raise that bar by improving the quality of your police officers, making them more competent, making them better trained, making them more skilled. None of that happens if we defund the police. That training all goes away, and we have police officers that will, by necessity and justifiably, increase their force dramatically and drastically because they don't have any other skills, right? If the only tool you have is a hammer, then every problem becomes a nail, and that's not how we want our law enforcement officers to respond.
Well, Randy, Currie, you guys are painting a pretty bleak view of kind of the situation out there, but we wouldn't be conservatives if we didn't at least have an optimism about the future and linking it to the present state. So let me ask you, with this contract for public safety, or this idea for this contract for public safety, given the reality as it is on reality's terms, how would this improve that department society, that department and those protected? How would it actually improve that situation? And what would be some of those points of increased accountability, increased connection to the community, all these things that we generally want when it comes to policing, but would sometimes be thrown under the bus when it comes to the defund movement, as Randy illustrated. I want to start with Currie with that.
Yeah, and I echo what Randy was saying earlier on many of those. The training issue becomes a major issue because that's how we make training and professional development. That's how we continue to improve ourselves. Let's look at the state of affairs in law enforcement right now. And if we look at the state of affairs in law enforcement right now, the major concern is we have a incredible recruiting and retention problem that's going on in law enforcement that's going to impact us not now, but in years to come. If you have let me give you an example. If I am a senior patrol officer, I've enjoyed my job, and I'm approaching my 19-year mark, and I've got my 20 years a month away, and I'm somebody that love my job. I appreciate the work that I do. I love the community that I'm in, but I'm tired of fighting the system. I'm tired of the accusations. I'm tired of not being protected by my organization, by my elected community, and by community leaders. I'm going to do an early out on my 20th year and go find another job. And in which that police officer, who would have been an incredible, mature police officer that educates younger police officers, that may have well had another 5, 6, 10 years in him or her, is going to be gone. And it's the same thing if we have command staff, sergeants, lieutenants, captains. We have people that are going to be retiring before they need to retire or getting out because they don't like the state of policing right now. With respect to how they're looked at, whether or not they're backed by the community, by their own department, and by elected leaders. So we have to reaffirm their rights. And I think the biggest thing about this contract is the public needs to be aware. And the more we talk about the impact of social media, the more we talk about caving in to the regular media if they make an accusation, the more we talk about not having timely cases go to court and go to court with factual information, the more we talk about that as law enforcement officers, as organizations like this foundation, the more we have a marketing effort, if you will, to make sure that people understand that we have the greatest judicial system in the world, in America, by far. And sometimes it's slow, sometimes it's cumbersome. Sometimes things don't turn out the way they should, but we have a process and a system in place where we have many levels that we can investigate wrongdoing. Everything from making bad decisions all the way up to criminal decisions that have been made by people that are in authority. We have a system in place. We have to make sure that we hold accountable those systems to be in place and make sure that we give time for those investigations to come to their fullest extent. So that's one. Right now, law enforcement, the only friend they feel like they have is the union. And anytime you make it where the union is the one that's going to have the most power, then they may end up having even more collective bargaining power, especially in cities that do not embrace right to work. Then you're going to have more and more problems when you're trying to get bad officers. And I'll make this, and I'm sure Randy would agree with me. Every police officer in an organization knows who the bad police officers are and are often supportive of those police officers being terminated. And it's a small percentage. It is not a large percentage. The vast majority of police officers that I've ever worked with are hardworking. They care about their community. They care about what they do. They want to have an impact. They want to serve something better than themselves. And they are fantastic people, honored people. But there is a percentage. There's a small percentage of police officers, and most police officers know who they are. And sometimes collective bargaining will not allow the bad police officers to get through the system and out of the system as soon as possible. So that's something else to embrace. Again, being transparent and accountable. And it's sometimes the police officers, I know when I interview police officers, sometimes they go, I don't understand we don't have transparency on an investigation, or I don't understand why something's not closed, or I don't understand why I don't have timetables to be able to get things done. So having that transparency is pretty important. We don't do a good job in doing really meaningful performance reviews. Like a lot of America, they don't do meaningful performance reviews. Performance reviews should capture, I'm a big believer in what was done in Los Angeles County in the late 2000s, where they started kind of an outcomes-based performance review, and they tied in complaints, and they looked at whether or not they should retrain people. And it goes back to earlier what was discussed by Randy, is that you can't defund police when 80% of your budget is salaries and benefits. You're going to have to cut training as a result. You're going to have to cut a lot of different programs, and the training is how we correct bad behavior. So there's law enforcement is an organization that wants to do good, and they want to have processes and procedures in place that can be followed to know that they stay on a good course. And if you don't have those things in place, and if you don't have a contract like this that can be upfront, that can be transparent, then you're going to have a lot of agencies. We're going to fall back into the same stuff that's been done down the road. I'm concerned. I'm not giving up. I think there's things that we can do to get better, but I'm really concerned at the lack of recruiting and retention that's going on right now in America for a lot of our great departments. And this is especially so in the bigger cities. I think the more right to work states and some of the smaller cities are actually going to pick up some officers who want to go work and maybe move and transfer. There's a significant void in talented people in the short term, and it's going to impact us in the long term.
Thank you for that, Currie. And Randy, I want to ask you the same question, but with a little bit of a different flavor. So given the current environment that we're in, what is it that actually can be done, and what has been done? Have we seen substantive reforms? Are there substantive reforms that have been already proposed, both here in this paper with the Contract for Public Safety and more broadly?
Yeah, and I think that the Contract for Public Safety, as Currie has outlined and written about and developed, is a major step forward, but it's going to take time to implement that. I mean, we're talking about a 50-state push, to try and get each state under their own laws and statutes and requirements to adopt something like that. That's a worthy goal. It's going to take time, but it would have massive improvement ability, both in transparency and for protection to good police officers, protections to good police officers. So that's one thing that's going on. The training component that we're doing now is looking to develop better police officers. That's the bottom line, that police officers that will be more constitutionally informed, but also more competent and capable and able to make better use of force decisions. That also takes time. It takes time to develop the curriculum. It takes time to implement it. It takes time to adopt it in the various states. But when we look at what has been done, we've seen some cities defund the police, right? Start making cuts. New York disbanded their plainclothes unit, their crime prevention unit, which I think was responsible for the highest percentage of arrests in the whole city, 600 officers. They have to move them into a different position. I mean, is that really what we want to do? That's the kind of things that have been done, these knee-jerk reactions that are hurting public safety. And unfortunately, it's the most vulnerable among us that are going to suffer as a result of that. right? The police already spend most of their time in the highest crime areas. What do you think will happen if you defund them? There'll be less of them able to do that. And the ones that do will be less trained and potentially less motivated when you're cutting hours and making them work overtime and salary issues, all of those things. So those are the contrast in what is being done, has been done, and will be done. I think over the summer we saw President Trump issue an executive order where he wanted to see improvements in certain policies through an accreditation process that could involve discretionary funding withholding for police departments that didn't perform in these various policy areas. One of them was use of force. Another one was what Currie just talked about, performance evaluations, with the goal there not being just improving performance, but also catching officers that might be struggling or headed down the wrong path, a mechanism that would capture that prior to a bad incident. And then the final one was in community engagement, which we've talked about already a little bit, and kind of goes to what Currie was talking about the bottom-up policing, right, where we engage not just line officers but the community in the development of our policy and the discussion of policing. So there's a lot going on. Not all of it's good. In fact, I tend to say that because the loudest people in the space right now have the worst ideas, a lot of it's bad, and we're hoping to change that. Training takes money. Right, it's the complete opposite of defunding the police. We're saying that policing is a core function of government, needs to be properly allocated with resources. That's one area that we need to for sure improve on, and it's the exact opposite of what you're hearing from the far left in resolving this. The other thing that we need to do is the legislatures need to start taking some accountability for their role in this. Currie and I have had plenty of conversations about overcriminalization, right? About the more laws that we create, sometimes to no good effect for as far as public safety is concerned. Sometimes, to be honest, probably revenue generating statutes. And then when law enforcement does enforce those and it goes wrong, it seems like the politicians are the only ones that are able to wash their hands of this and say, well, we're not sure why this happened. Well, it happened because you made a law and expected law enforcement to enforce it. I think that there's a lot of cleanup we could do in a lot of our statutes as far as what are we having the police enforce and why.
Well, if I can follow up with that real quick, is that okay, Derek? I mean,
Absolutely.
Randy hit the nail on the head. I mean, one of the reasons that I was so attracted to the Texas Public Policy Foundation, now going on, I think, my 5th year being a part of this mission, is the overcriminalization issue. So we've been talking about reforming a lot of things in the criminal justice. This just isn't something we've started just because of COVID and the riots that are occurring. But if you look at overcriminalization, that still is a major issue that we have to address because that affects the perception of the public's, or at least the public's perception of law enforcement. So, when you see law enforcement doing things that are more regulatory or things done by edict, as opposed to following the legislative process on laws or following the city ordinance where it's been done correctly, that's one of the problems that is existing. But we also need to go back and make sure that we understand the law of unintended consequences anytime we make a new law or a new city ordinance. How is that going to affect the perception of a law enforcement agency in that jurisdiction? And I'll tell you right now, I'm not really liking what I'm seeing on this COVID-19 resurgence with respect to law enforcement being used for enforcing edicts that have been done by mayors and local judges and by governors, as opposed to following the legislation. And I've got to really applaud. There's a lot of my colleagues across the country, former sheriffs, who are huge believers in the Constitution, that a lot of them are taking a stand and saying, we're not going to be involved in that process. But at the same time, you can see these cities and counties in some states, they might be hiring people just to do enforcement outside the purview of law enforcement. They're going to be hiring their own cops, if you will, going to be doing it, and talk about a bunch of folks that are going to be out, not trained, interacting with the community, enforcing the law on edicts. That is a major problem that we have to be aware of and make sure that's reined in.
You know, Currie, I couldn't have said it better myself. I remember when some of the more criminally enforced lockdown measures went into effect. You know, I wrote about two young ladies down here in the Valley who were jailed for 2 days for cutting hair in an otherwise socially distanced manner, and they were given essentially the full freight that a municipal court could give them under the current order, in which they are arrested, magistrated, actually placed in holding for 2 days. If that's the case, and we're looking to reduce exposure, how is putting somebody in jail basically a pressure cooker for COVID-19 and then releasing them back out into the community 48 hours later, looking to slow the spread or anything like that? And in fact, it's basically it's creating a petri dish, if you will. So when we talk about over-criminalization, it's almost a libertarian trope when they say, if we're going to make a law, at the end of the road, we need to be okay with somebody with a gun, perhaps enforcing it. Over-criminalization is not just looking at a duck from a plane on Tuesday and all these things that we read about in the weird laws section of the newspaper. These actually impact real people. And I thank both you gentlemen for bringing that up. Now, Currie, going back to you. So you actually talk about reaffirming officers' rights. What specific rights are you talking about that are being overlooked, and how would the kind of dual purpose, both ensuring the rights and accountability side of this contract for public safety, address that?
Well, I think Randy and I hit on it at various times, just even in this particular conference that we're talking about it, but it's really, there is nothing more important to society than having due process. That it's the thing that we treasure the most. It's the thing that keeps us from just being rounded up and thrown into jail. Understanding our rights and understanding that there's a process to be followed when you're accusing somebody of a crime is one of the most important things that we need to focus on. And I hate to keep going back to it, but social media and the media have had a tendency to, and social media is the public. It's not some imaginary thing. It's us, on Facebook and on Twitter, responding to something without full information. So when you put that together with media who need things hot and now and want to have a story right now, then we're putting out stuff before law enforcement officers. And it's not just law enforcement officers, anybody who's been accused of a crime and it's public and it's an interest to the public is not being afforded their true constitutional rights, especially with respect to due process, in my opinion. I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a constitutional lawyer, but that's my perception. And when you have that perception going on, law enforcement officers are going to be scared to do their job. Right now, you're going to have law enforcement officers not really enforcing the laws that are on the books because they're concerned about whether or not they're going to be thrown in jail someday for taking some action that actually was proper, it was according to their training, was statutorily correct, and they still could be facing some sort of investigation and termination and prison sentence by a prosecutor's office. So why aren't we holding prosecutors accountable for going above their authority, color of authority? We talk all the time about police officers and color of authority. We never talk about prosecutorial misconduct and going on and above their color of authority. So being able to potentially go after prosecutors that are rogue, that are not following the law, that if they need, I know they're elected officials just like a sheriff, perhaps they have to be impeached or some process or brought by the attorney general for not following the Constitution. There are avenues in which this can be done, but we have a tendency to throw everything on the law enforcement officer, and we don't look at the prosecution side. We don't look at the judge's side. We don't look at the elected official side who make the laws, and understand that, again, they have unintended consequences with every decision that they make that has to be examined before, that statute gets out there. So it's, if you're a police officer today, and if you don't feel like you're going to be backed, and no one wants to go to jail, and especially you don't want to go to jail if you did everything according to your training, according to the statute, and it's still not good enough, that you're going to be run through the coals. And let me add this one more thing. We have seen many, many police officers that have been adjudicated through this, been investigated. They've been either adjudicated, or prosecutors have also said there's not enough evidence to go forward. And many of these police officers have still had to leave their jobs because of the public pressure and the casting of doubt onto their careers. We live in a cancel culture, and we have people that have gone after police officers when they've been fully adjudicated and not convicted, or they have been found by the prosecutor with not enough evidence to go forward, and they still have to leave their careers and their job and their passion because of the public scrutiny and the threats that are going on. And that is a horrible thing.
Currie, I think that's a very good point you make, and I'd like to put a underline on that for our viewers. Essentially, what you're saying, and what I think is one of the greatest contributions of this contract for public safety, is you're saying a lot of that accountability on the actual accountability side is sometimes being forsworn because of some of the legitimate functions that happen on the collective bargaining side, simply because it basically shoves it all into one basket, into one collective bargaining agreement. And then you have everything from pay, wages, scheduling, and then on down the line to training, discipline, and everything else. And the inability to extricate one from the other is where we're basically getting this package deal. And so that being said, the ability to, codify some of these protections in statute, as opposed to, through collective bargaining agreement, allows for that accountability when that accountability needs to be happen, because we know that, to your point, the legitimacy of the protections pre-exist the actual incident in question, whatever it may be. Yeah. So moving on, Randy, I'd like to ask each of you one more question before we throw it open to our audience for question and answers. Randy, and really piggybacking off of what Currie had just said, you basically see a lot of the, investigations, both good and bad, being dictated either in social media or in the media or in, or through offices that are not actually unbiased observers, whether they are within the police department, an adjacent police department, prosecutor's office, whatever the case may be. The point being that it's really hard to find an actual neutral arbiter of this. And you've written a lot about uses of force during your time here. I kind of want to ask you that with this particular proposal, with the contract for public safety, how would the investigations of, say, use of force incidents be improved? How would the transparency and accountability be improved? But also, how would we make sure that we had the right fact pattern, the right information going forward, be ensured by this proposal?
Well, I think that the contract for public safety provides not only the transparency so that we understand what's going on, how it was decided, what was decided, but also provides the protection for the police officers, ideally the insulation from being political scapegoats. Currie mentioned the Georgia shooting that happened over this summer, where the prosecutor indicted the police officer on murder and prompted the Georgia Bureau of Investigations to say, just so everyone's aware, we haven't even finished our investigation on this yet. You would think the prosecutor would be embarrassed by that. I mean, talk about a lack of due process. We don't investigate other crimes that way, where we just arrest somebody based on what we think might happen and then try to develop a case afterwards before we've even figured out in the investigation whether or not the crime occurred. Or meets the requirements for a crime. Murder is a pretty high standard, which unfortunately a lot of prosecutors feel that they have to charge police officers in these instances with murder, even if in some cases they probably know they can't prove murder. they're just pushing the anger down the line, right? They're responding to the mob mentality, the mob rule, where the mob is not demanding justice, they're demanding revenge. So they think that giving a murder charge will satisfy them, but that actually makes it just that much worse later if the officer is acquitted because they didn't meet that requirement. You can, by providing officers with due process, you can be sure that if you do end up prosecuting a police officer, that they're probably going to be convicted because the proper investigation was done. And it will also eliminate those instances that Currie was touching on, where a police officer did everything right but was convicted in the court of public opinion and the media prior to any adjudication of the case. And now, even though they've done nothing wrong, they end up having to leave their job. That's not right either, and society shouldn't want that for the people that are serving and protecting them either. Use of force right now, is objectively reasonable. It's the standard under Graham versus Connor, meaning that the police officer, a police officer in similar circumstances with similar training and background and all of those things, that the force that they chose was reasonable under the circumstances. Not that it was the least intrusive method, right? But that it was reasonable. We can raise that through what we're talking about by making better police officers that are more skilled in the application of force. A police officer that's confident in their skills and genuinely is competent in their skills, is able to make better use of force decisions. They don't have to escalate force as quickly as an officer who's out of shape and unskilled. They don't have the option to delay that or to try something else if they have no training or skills.
Thank you, Randy. And Currie, right before we kick to audience questions, so you've written extensively of this bottom-up policing, which is obviously a key component of the contract for public safety. Just so we don't leave our viewers in a lurch, can you explain what bottom-up policing is and kind of encapsulate it for those who are wondering?
Yeah, in general, thanks for mentioning that paper. In general, systematically in the past, there's always been a top-down approach to law enforcement management, and that has a tendency to limit ideas, solutions. You don't really get the true impact of what's going on in the field. And in often cases, we don't involve the community at that level as well. We may do it after. You talk about community policing. Sometimes that's after we've put together a plan or a goal or a mission, and having more of a groundswell of support from the line officers, from the first line supervisors, from the community itself, as you build goal setting, as you build the department for the key mission that they're going to do. So having input from the field level, from officers, I've always believed, Kansas is a right to work state, but that doesn't mean that Kansas ignores the fact that they have to have a bottom-up approach to get officers to give their opinions, give their ideas, give their concepts, because man, there's some great ideas out there that aren't thought of sometimes in the upper echelon. Sometimes we live in a world of our own cognitive biases, if you will, and especially confirmation bias, where leaders get together and they want to do something, and all of a sudden they think it's a great idea and it's put out, when understanding down the firing line whether or not those ideas are going to meet with some challenge that wasn't thought of. Some agencies are doing that. For instance, the county where I was sheriff, Johnson County Sheriff's Office, Sheriff Calvin Hayden and his staff has really embraced this bottom-up level. It's really encouraged police officers. They feel like they have a voice in making decisions, and they have a voice on the direction of the organization. In Texas, we have Randy Peterson is the sheriff of Montgomery County. He's put together out business plans and strategies that include the department as well as his officers. And so you see an organization that understands what their mission is. There's great buy-in. And even in Texas, you have the DPS. You have DPS that has done some of the bottom-up approach already, and how they are trying to get their officers to have a voice. So there are some departments doing it, but the more we can focus on having that bottom-up approach to make sure key stakeholders And the key stakeholders are line officers, mid-level supervisors, and the community itself. Both, and I don't want to forget, the community is not just citizens, but businesses in the community. Often businesses don't have a voice in the community because they're not the ones that are electing people, because they're not, may not be residents of that community. But having law enforcement make sure that they understand businesses and what their needs are as well is extremely important.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Currie, Randy. We have about 15 minutes left, so I want to dive into some of these questions that we have. Some very good ones in there, but I want to start off with something more of a positive question. An individual asked, are there examples of departments and areas where policing and training is going well? What can be learned from those cities or departments? Currie, you just mentioned a few, and I'll come back to you. But Randy, let's start with you. So in other words, instead of looking at what needs to be done and the Herculean task that's before us, what are some places that have already achieved good, already achieved some progress on this issue, and what can be learned and what can be emulated?
I think every department has been making changes as a result of the unrest. We can't lose sight of the fact that the unrest also, I've been critical of the people rioting and all of that, but also the unrest sometimes does point to us where we can improve, right? And if we cut through all of the the screeching and burning that was going on, there are areas where law enforcement can improve, and I think that a lot of departments have understood that. The problem in having a department do that is that there's no police department in the United States that doesn't wish they could do more training. Right. I mean, that's just you could ask every police officer, they would prefer to be better trained. They would prefer to have more time and money to do it. And they don't. I don't know of any departments right now, and there may be, that haven't increased their training budget and their training cycles to respond to this in this manner. Not because they wouldn't want to. That needs to be very clear. It's not that police officers don't train because they don't want to. It's because there's just not the funding available. There's just, there's too many examples right now of agencies that have had their budgets cut to look at any right now that are saying, oh yeah, we've increased it. We're doing better training, more training. So I don't have any specific examples on that. I can give you a couple of examples though, where obviously the opposite direction has been happening with tragic results.
Currie, same question. What are some positive spots we can look forward?
Well, I think there are some departments, and I mentioned the ones earlier because they have done a great job. And sometimes you have to, this is where a sheriff can play an important role, because a sheriff is a duly elected official in that county. Their relationship with the county commissioners are one where they go before the county commission and ask for monies dedicated, and they can make an argument why training is going to be more important. And once they get the monies, of course, in most states, the sheriff can then take that budget that's been afforded to them and be able to use it for different things. But a sheriff making that argument of why they need to have the training and make sure they have the resources to have that training is extremely important. And I think that's where, Sheriff Henderson in Montgomery County and Sheriff Hayden in Johnson County, Kansas, and Sheriff Henderson in Montgomery County, Texas have been successful because they're willing to go make that argument and make sure that they have funding tied to it. It is about funding. If we're talking about defunding and 80% of your budget really is salary and benefits, then you got to cut somewhere, and training usually is the first thing that gets cut. There's statutory training that has to be done. There's post guidelines that law enforcement officers have. So there could be state statutes, and in this contract for policing, one of my suggestions is that we make sure and cover appropriate training that is on and beyond the current levels that we have. Most of the current levels we have are really basic training. They're statutory. They're requirements that the state has to follow, and the state agencies, the police agencies have to follow. But ensuring that there's other training in there that's got to be done is extremely important. And then you got to find the time to train the officers, and that costs. because they're not out in the field. You know, there's only certain times that you can train people in the course of a month's time. So it's not the end of the world. There's things that we can do, but it's if we're fighting funding issues, and if we're fighting a lack of manpower and recruiting, then training is always going to take a back door, unfortunately.
Actually, Currie, you just completely teed up the next question that we have, and I'd like to go to Randy and then back to you, Currie, on this. Essentially, what can be done to see that this curriculum or this particular approach is passed? In other words, legislatively, Randy, what are the next steps?
Well, legislatively, ideally, we would start to see the research that we're doing, which is the development of curriculum and methodology in training, particularly in physical skills, be mandated across the state of Texas. Maybe even further than that, but right now, being the Texas Public Policy Foundation, we're focused on getting it done in Texas. You know, the every one of these incidents that we've seen has been a result of a use of force issue, whether good or bad. I've seen plenty of these riots that are a result of what I can very subjectively look at and say was probably a justified use of force, and we're still seeing a city burn down because of it. But it's use of force issues almost all the time. That's where the training has to come in. A police officer, physical skills for police officers are very perishable. There's been studies done by Force Science Institute out of Illinois that show that police academy graduates very often don't remember any of the physical skills, sometimes even at the time of graduation, because they're given these block and silo training tactics where they get a block of instruction and then move on to something else, and it's never integrated or retouched. And by the time they graduate, they don't even remember any of these physical skills that they've learned. Firearms are the same way, very perishable skill. If we don't change the way we're delivering this training to people, to police officers, they will remain unskilled unless they came to the agency with different skills and or seek those skills outside of the agency. You know, in high school, I was a wrestler, and our coach didn't give us a 1 week of 40 hours of wrestling practice and then say, okay, we'll see you in November for your first match. You know, it didn't work that way. It was, you know, an hour to 2 hours per day, every day of the week, all the way up until the season started. That's how almost all physical skills are trained outside of policing. Policing does not follow, because of time and resource constraints, does not follow any sort of training methodology that makes any sense from a physical skills standpoint.
Thank you, Randy. Currie, same question. You know, what would the next steps be, and to take a different approach, you know, whether that be at the state, local, or federal level, what would you like to see be done in pursuit of this sort of reform agenda?
Well, and TPPF and Randy specifically has done an excellent job in writing a lot of training papers related to training that I think need to be looked at and embraced even more. So I encourage people to take a look at the public works that he has done, because they really are very, very good. I was very blessed in my career. I worked for 3 different agencies. I was a Kansas trooper, and at that time we were very well trained, not only onboarding and in through the academy, but there was opportunities to have specialized training throughout my career. I went on then to the Kansas Bureau of Investigation as a special agent. And I will tell you that that organization spent a lot of time, talent, and treasure on training their staff to make sure that they were the best. We went to specialized schools, and it developed excellent investigators in that agency. And when I became sheriff of Johnson County, it's a large sheriff's office in Kansas. It serves a population of about 650,000. It has a pretty good tax base to it from an economic point of view. And we continued, you know, it was a great department with great people and good training standards. And I just carried on and tried to increase the opportunities for training and professional development there. And those sheriffs after me have continued those programs and developed their own that have been on and above, such as Sheriff Hayden on kind of, the bottom up side policing. So I think it takes an executive who's going to make training a part of the culture of the organization, and not just onboarding training and initial training, but professional development throughout a police officer's career is extremely important, because everybody has different talents. If you look at a good police officer, they're going to have an area of focus that they're really good at. And what you want to do is try to embrace that potential area of focus for that individual officer, because they're going to take off and succeed like no one can imagine if they're doing something that they really have talent for. And all of us have different talents in different areas that they can focus on, but you got to make it a priority and a culture within your organization. Yes, it does take money, but you also have to be willing to defend it and stand in front of people to make an argument why you have to have it. And that is, having a voice that continues to talk about, wait a minute, we can't cut funding because we got to do X, Y, and Z. And the last thing is, we have to focus on core government services again, because what we don't want to have is competing dollars with non-core government services. When you have limited funding, then if you're trying to spread that around all kinds of different government programs that may not be core government services, then those are competing tax dollars. Let's fund core government services first and make sure that they have the funding necessary to do the job that they are supposed to do for the citizens of their jurisdiction.
That's very well said, Currie. And we can do a whole, and we have done a whole additional live stream about what Austin is specifically is putting some of its money to call it core government service, even in the reimagining of public safety, is a bit of a stretch. But I want to close with this, guys. We're coming up on our time here, so I want to close with this one question that I really like. And let's go reverse order here. Let's go Currie and then Randy from that last question. And the question reads: with Thanksgiving next week, any pointers on how we can effectively communicate these ideas about defunding the police with family members? In other words, how do we explain, kind of what the rhetoric is versus what the policy position is, and how we could actually express a conservative viewpoint on that topic, which is basically, as we've seen in the last several months, been defined by, to borrow a phrase from Randy, the loudest voice in the room.
It's a great question. It's a great question. And I must say that I have it easy, because I have 5 children and 6 grandchildren with 2 on the way. And to a T, all of them are very supportive of law enforcement and doing the right thing. So I have an easy Thanksgiving when it comes to talking with people and trying to convince them. The difficulty sometimes I have is friends and colleagues that we want to make sure and educate on why it's important to make sure that law enforcement is treated with respect. That respect is mutually earned and has got to be earned. We got to do things right. And it also means that there's opportunities for improvements that we have to internally look at and say, I have to do a better job in my organization and my career too. So it's a two-way street. There's a happy medium here, but I think Randy hit the nail on the head earlier. We are responding to the 5% of people that are the loudest screamers. We're not responding to the 95% of people out there that want to do the right thing. They're supportive of law enforcement. They want fair and transparency, but they want honest, good working police officers out on the street. And we have to refocus and take away the narrative. We're spending way too much time on social media and way too much time on the 5% of people out there that are unreasonable and uneducated on the topic.
Randy, same question. Currie teed you up pretty well on that.
Yeah, I don't have much to add beyond what Currie said. The only thing I would say is to reiterate to those willing to listen that policing is a core function of government, that the police are just as much a part of their community as they are a part of government, and that we need to see them in that light, that they are this complex duality, and then to explain that as a core function of government, they need to be properly funded, and that proper funding ensures that they will remain the community guardians that we want them to be, and how defunding would destabilize that and be dangerous. That's probably the simplest argument that we could make with the limited time left.
Well, gentlemen, I really appreciate that, and obviously our audience online has as well. I just want to close by saying, Currie, Randy, thank you so much for your work in this space. I think it's a valuable contribution and conversation starters. Whether or not you have to bring it up at Thanksgiving or not, Currie, I think it's a good template to have going forward, and it's a good thing that we have folks like you guys working on it. So. Guys, everyone, please join us at texaspolicy.com for this to find any sort of materials that were referenced here in this live stream. Our YouTube page is where this will be archived, and we look forward to talking to you all in the future.
Thank you.
Pleasure.